So, ladies, gentlemen, and others, welcome to the Civil Society Forum. This is quite a historic moment because, as you all know, this is the second time that we have an SDG Summit. It's the first time that we have a Civil Society Forum running in parallel with the summit. And that's, of course, something we are excited about and something that we are intrigued by as well when it comes to the role of the Civil Society Forum and in what ways the forum can feed in to the conversations in the summit itself. Some of you may have studied the agenda, and you will know that we have an agenda that has 3 segments. We're going to start by analyzing the current state of play. We have chosen to focus on the systemic side of things, really aiming to identify some of the structural barriers to progress. This is a very conscious decision because we feel that this is a side of the story that isn't necessarily sufficiently reflected in the conversations at the SDG Summit. So that's our first segment, an analysis of where we are at. The second segment is going to look at what do we do, what can be done to unlock progress. And this is very much a segment where we are hoping for some more concrete, some more constructive ideas around what to do in the last decade of SDG action. And the last segment is going to look at what we've called the institutional arrangements, which could be put more simply as how do we make sure that it happens? How do we monitor progress? How do we keep track? How do we hold to account? So that will be our last segment. We are hoping to have an outcome document that will be more of a summary of the conversations. We were laughing with Dan planning this session, discussing whether the outcome document might have been agreed already in July. But of course, that's not what we are doing here. We are aiming to really summarize the conversations and have a document that can be shared not only with the member states, but also with the UN itself and the highest levels of decision-making within the UN. 2 practical things before we kick off. We are aiming to have an interactive space. This is a space for conversation, for debate. So we are going to open up the floor. When we do so, we're going to ask you to stick to 2 minutes. And this is really about solidarity, because sometimes solidarity is to keep your own remarks short enough to allow others to be heard as well. So we're going to stick to 2 minutes. And last but not least, we do not have translation here today, and we apologize for that. When the Civil Society Forum is held next year, some of you might have heard the Secretary General announce his intention to have annual gatherings of some sort. The first one will be in September 2020, as far as I understood. And our aspiration is, of course, to have a Civil Society Forum then too, and to make sure that it's one with translation. So, we have an opening segment, and as this is a Civil Society Forum, we're going to start off our opening with hearing from civil society. So I'm going to hand over to Dan Perel from the Baha'i International Community and also the NGO Major Group. Please, Dan.
Thank you, Antonia, and good evening, everybody. You're allowed to respond. Good evening, everybody. This is a civil society forum. It doesn't need to emulate some of the other formalities of other spaces. So please, smile, nod. Thank you. It's nice to see you. So I've been asked just to provide a little bit of context, and I think it's firstly very important to say the vital role that an independent and free civil society plays around the world. Only with these diverse perspectives and experiences can effective policymaking take place, and it's often civil society, those who are meant to benefit from policies, who are able to offer the lived experience in the hallowed halls of the UN and other spaces. As such, I'm very grateful to all of you for braving the long lines and the traffic and all the other impediments to coming here, for just being present in this space. It's quite a statement, even our being here together. And for those of you who are unaware of how the system works for civil society participation in the HLPF space, we're organized through a system known as the major groups and other stakeholders. This structure is meant to give voice to a variety of different constituencies within civil society, broadly defined, so that we're able to contribute a diversity of perspectives to the UN and its member states. There are currently 18 such constituencies, but more are likely to come in the future. And these major groups and other stakeholders have come together to put on today's program, which we hope will give ample opportunity for our voices to be heard and recommendations to be communicated across the international system. That's who we are. But I also think it's important to analyze this moment in human history. To many, it appears to have much more darkness than light. But I'm hopeful that during the next few hours, we can spend more time perceiving and understanding the magnitude of the light that we truly have around us. Not to ignore the numerous injustices in the world, but to consider what's needed to move forward at this moment. For example, our current narratives need to be rethought. Success, even development, is largely defined in terms of the accumulation of material wealth. But the science is clear regarding the harm that extreme wealth causes in the world, both to the wealthy and to society as a whole. Yet the excesses we decry in rhetoric are often praised in the media and therefore represent the logical results of the goals and values that we are all told to embrace. If science is not enough to demonstrate the limitations of the current model, we have an emerging prophetic voice coming from the youth who are leaving institutions of learning to tell us our house is literally on fire. But are they not our treasure and those for whom we are all working? This should not be their burden, though their voices are vital, just as this crisis is not their doing. Those of us in this building have a duty to not only put out the fires, but to learn how to rebuild in a way that prevents future fires. It's clear that knowledge is no longer the gap. We have the evidence, we know the reality. The gap is commitment, in creativity, and most of all, in courage. The world is one. Our interconnection and our interdependence can no longer be denied. Yet the systems and structures in place are a patchwork of treaties and institutions, a far cry from the organic wholeness of humanity and the earth. It's as if we've tried to build a bus by taping together horses, bicycles, and cars. The Sustainable Development Goals, if applied at all levels of governance, would represent an important advancement in our collective thinking about the nature of progress, but writing the goals is distinct from realizing them. And though the former was difficult, it is in the latter where humanity is truly being tested. The intersecting crises we see now give us the vantage point to recognize the limits of, for example, a growth-based paradigm or the pursuit of power over others. But again, knowledge is not the limiting factor. Courage and sacrifice to counteract the inertia of our current order, especially from those who benefit most, is what limits us. We see that we can no longer afford the preservation and protection of systems that perpetuate an unsustainable status quo. We know we need policy action and individual action to reduce, for example, carbon emissions, but many lack the will to do it. We know that discrimination against any group results in harm to all, and yet we fall into patterns of power and identity which don't make room for everyone's voice. Far from a source of despair, however, humanity's growing understanding is a cause for optimism. We're standing at the precipice collectively, and the opportunity to take decisive, constructive steps is actually quite exciting. And we all are protagonists in this process. And this opens up a key role for global policy as well. It must align with the vision articulated tonight and 4 years ago and in the future. This is a call to move beyond the UN as merely a forum. And this can begin by recognizing the many gaps at the global level and working with organized civil society in genuine partnership to fill those gaps. And hopefully that's what will come out of this evening's gathering, opportunities to fill gaps and work in partnership and move forward collectively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. We're going to turn to Maria Francesca Spatolizano, who is the Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs within UNDESA. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Distinguished moderators, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to join you all at this important forum of civil society for SDGs. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development reflects the voices of millions of peoples from across the globe who informed government leaders of their aspirations for the world we want. I'm sure many of you were there among the major groups and other stakeholders who enthusiastically engaged in that intergovernmental process to elaborate the agenda and its goals, the 17 Integrated Sustainable Development Goals. As a result of that engagement, we are now celebrating the universal agenda, which is truly of the people, by the people, and for the people. Today's summit is your summit. It is befitting that your representatives are speaking in the leaders' dialogues with and along the member states' representative and the UN system. I have a few points to make today, and all revolve around what we can do and should do together. Earlier this afternoon, member states adopted the declaration by consensus. I won't go into whether it was before or later. This declaration commits world leaders to a decade of action and delivery for the SDGs. It also commits them to come together in durable partnerships with all relevant stakeholders, including the civil society, the private sector, academia, youth. And it is clear that the SDGs will only be reached with the participation of all countries, all stakeholders, and all people. Ladies and gentlemen, the success of this collective journey to 2030 will greatly depend on how effectively governments, who, let's not forget it, spearheaded the implementation of this transformative agenda, can engage many actors, parliaments, local authorities, indigenous communities, civil society, scientific and academia community, private sector, can engage in the follow-up. And this requires bridging the gaps between the people and the national policy setting. So in many countries, including in some who have presented their voluntary national reviews at the high-level political forum on sustainable development, we are seeing how effective public participation can lead to better laws, policies, and transparency in government. All these factors help to foster accountability and inclusion. For example, Target 16.7 of the SDGs. It's about ensuring responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. And you have a critical role in advocating and promoting this transformation at the national and international level. Now, of course, we need an enabling environment for participation, and this is clearly expressed in SDG 16 and 17, the goals of peace, justice, strong institutions, and on partnership. Responsible leadership, legal frameworks that adhere to human rights standards, greater investment in transparent and accountable institutions are all critical to make this happen. Civil society should be given the space, the tools, the resources, and the capacity development it needs to steer the implementation and follow-up of the 2030 Agenda at all levels. Success is also measured in how well we manage to engage the most marginalized and vulnerable and excluded communities and individuals. In all this, ladies and gentlemen, you can make the difference. This is why I'm so pleased to see you all gathered here today. At a time when multilateralism is often under attack you are demonstrating its very dynamism. Indeed, multilateralism is also about bringing actors from all countries and walks of life around the table to find common solutions to our shared challenges. This kind of multi-stakeholder multilateralism is the only way to navigate the complex challenges we are facing today, from the ambitious SDGs to frontier technologies, and we need to unleash multiple ideas. This kind of multi-stakeholder multilateralism is what creates an understanding of our realities at the local and country level and galvanizes the efforts from all sides and produces solutions that the society-wide can enjoy. This is why the United Nations now increasingly works through platforms that embrace the civil society and other actors. A chief example is indeed the high-level political forum, which is today meeting as a summit, as we all know. Other powerful examples are the ECOSOC multi-stakeholder forum on science, technology, and innovation, and also the Internet Governance Forum. More than ever, the United Nations is your home, and we need you here to achieve the SDGs. Dear participants, on behalf of the Secretary General, I urge you all to engage in the coming decade of action and delivery for achieving the 2030 Agenda. Our collective ambition to deliver on the SDGs is critical to our common future. DESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, as always, stands ready to facilitate your engagement in the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you also so much from our side. Maria Francesca, if I can address you like that. We've been informed that Alicia Barcena, who was supposed to join you here at the opening, will no longer be able to make it. Apparently, the Secretary General himself has called a special meeting of all of the executive secretaries. And I guess we have to accept that as quite a valid excuse. Those of you who have read the news today may also have theories around what they are discussing. That means that we've come to the end of our opening segment. Hopefully it also means that we have more time for an interactive conversation as we kick off with our first thematic panel. And with that, no, actually, I forgot something very crucial. Because I said that we were going to capture the conversations, and we have 3 rapporteurs that are helping us do that. And I really want to acknowledge them because we will really need their notes. That's Janine Jassy from the Indigenous Peoples Major Group, it's Karen Phillip from the Women's Major Group, and it's Alyssa Mottahead from the NGO Major Group. So let's give them some applause. Thanks so much. And with that, we will kick off thematic panel number 1.
So with those of you whose names are on the program, please come join us up here. That's Emilia Reyes, Gemma Santana, and Rosala Khumba. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Very appreciated to have you here.
I was trying to suggest to the Secretary General that they should just have that meeting here. I thought that, I mean, if they want to know what the regional people have to say, they could come listen here. But unfortunately, that request was never transmitted. So for this panel, we have the wonderful opportunity to hear from a number of my closest friends and hopefully future closest friends on the systemic analysis for the current state of implementation. So essentially, this is the analysis portion. What's happening in the world? What are some obstacles to progress? What are some interesting confluences that can help to reframe the nature and the interconnection of these development challenges. And I'm going to spend less time on bios of the individuals. I think that's why we have Google, so you can look up the bios themselves, and this way they can contribute more of their perspective. So I'll turn now to Emilia to begin the conversation, please.
Hi, hello. I'm very happy to be here because this was a very desired forum, and the steering group has been wanting to have this for so long. So this is great, and so thank you for being here, and thank you to the panel. I have a very difficult task that is setting the apocalyptic context, and luckily there will be some panels later coming up with proposals on how to address apocalypse. But I wanted to share with you many bad words with you, which is figures of many contexts, because it is my sense that the Sustainable Development Framework is coming from different platforms like the Paris Agreement on the one hand, and the FFD on another, the SDGs on the other, the Sendai Framework, and then civil societies used to talk also with their own lingo and the silos, and we are missing, I think, the greatest opportunities to finding a common ground on how we are analyzing the challenges. But also, I think we're also missing the point on the type of requests that we're having to our member states. I'm just going to start with some figures. You all know by Oxfam that 26 billionaires own the wealth equivalent to the world's 50% poorest combined. That is, I think, a regular figure that we don't often try to relate with the type of ask that we're having in our agendas. But this relates to the discussion that we're having in the FFD arena, in which we're saying that there is a financialization of the world, because this means that there is an increasing power of the financial actors in the global dynamics. And this overexpansion of financial assets and markets means that there is more private money than public money. And so when we're trying to aim at how are we solving the solutions, and we're addressing the mandate of member states, we keep on addressing that figure that relates to the public money, and we're not looking at the larger figures. And there is indeed then this gap between private and public capital. For instance, let me go to the Paris Agreement. And so we know that for the Green Climate Fund, we are expecting $100 billion commitment per year by 2020. And so the latest figures by the OECD says that in 2017, there was 71.2 billion allocated. And on this 2016, 58 billions. That is for the Paris Agreement, and we are all really in awe about what is happening with this emergency for human survival. So this is the figure that we are expecting to have allocated related to 100 billion. On the other hand, this was published 3 days ago, the Chase Bank allocated $196 billion to the fossil fuel industry. So in the last 3 years, 200 billion were allocated to invest ultra-deep sea drilling, Arctic extraction, and on, just in the past 3 years. But the Chase said, oh no, but we're heading into the clean direction. So by 2025, they're going to allocate 200 billion on clean energy. So the figure that they already spent in 3 years, they expect to give it to 2025. But these 200 billions, I want you to compare it with the 100 billions that we're expecting every year for the Green Climate Fund, and we're not even getting those in the last years. So as opposed to that, we have other figures coming as well from the FFD arena, which is we have an estimation of about 500 billions leaving annually the Global South on illicit financial flows. 500 billion annually. So Tove is gonna, I'm sure she's gonna enlighten us on that issue itself. But just East Africa is expected to release 2 billion every year. So actually it is now considered that Africa is one of the largest, let us say, donors, and not they're on the receiving end on the figures of the financial flows, because it's actually Africa, the region where more money is coming out. So this means that we have said this all along, that the Global South is subsidizing not only the Global North, but the entire economy. But also I wanted to say as well some reality checks for us, civil society. For instance, that in the case of, we, as you know, we are from the Women's Major Group, and we have been showing all this time how women are subsidizing the economy by means of their unpaid domestic and care work. There is not enough money in the world to pay for the work that they're doing. And yet, of all these new trend about financing women's empowerment and stuff, we know by AWID that only 1% of the entire funding for gender equality goes to feminist and women's organizations, despite the fact that we know that all the advancements on women's human rights is because there is a presence of feminist and women's organizations, so only 1%, because the rest is going to business and governments and INGOs, who are actually keeping the largest share of the money and not to the real organizations on the ground. So this is something that what I want to say is things are already there, and it's like we're not having the clarity on where to start. And just to say as well, in this world of figures, that it is said that if we reach to the 3 degrees of warming, we will be in need of $550 trillion just to address the damages. That means that even more money than we currently have, right? And for those who say that this is why we need to bring the private sector on board and bring tax incentives, I'm sure Tove is going to address how precisely it is the flow that is going to this financialization and the work of the private sector in not being accountable for what they're doing, that we are in this state. And so when we're here from member states that we need to bring tax incentives so that the private sector is on board with us, we know that tax incentives rank low in reasons for investment in low-income countries, and many of these are actually redundant. So investment would have been undertaken even without them anyway. And I just wanted to highlight in this panorama that the small island development states are also facing the greatest damage, and especially on disasters impacted by climate change. But we have a figure that is very striking. 40% of low-income countries are either in high debt stress already, or in high risk of going into debt stress. So there are all these challenges in which we are seeing how there is not only an imbalance. So I want to close by inviting maybe the social movements to start engaging in stronger dialogues, in sharing expertise, and maybe also for us who believe in multilateralism, how to address these challenges that are going outside the regular problems of the nation states, or maybe negotiating groups, and how are we going to advocate for stronger ideas. I mean, I've been running out of proposals, but I think this is something that we need to think collectively. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emilia. And we'll turn now to Ms. Gema Santana. We are most grateful to you and to the government of Mexico for coming to this space. We have invited many member states. We would love to be working in partnership, and Mexico was not just willing, but pleased to come and share some thoughts. So thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm sorry for my Spanglish. I'm going to try to explain myself. And I'm very happy to be here, because before I am in the government of Mexico, I was working in NGOs. So I came from NGOs, working directly with communities, indigenous communities, environmental projects, and at the same time, circle economy. So that is my expertise. So now I am here trying to push this vision, important vision, in the government of Mexico, to think about how to think, systematic as a system, because our body is a system. We need to plan as a system. So it is quite important to understand this important vision. So let me tell you. Main lessons of the Federal Public Administration of Mexico to the alignment of the 2030 Agenda into the further plans of the National Development Plan. 2030 Agenda is highly linked to the national priorities. However, a deep vision of systemic thinking is needed in order to understand why all the previous efforts hasn't worked for so long. The country should be as an holistic approach. On that way, we could perceive acupuncture points that could really generate a healthier whole system. Actual predominant system in Mexico should stop being seen in parts. Imperative to look from a whole approach. That should be the first transformation. The inertia of so many years on so many sectors is breaking the development of the whole. Next, please. I'm going to show you some slides. Next, please. You can see here, the mostly of us, we used to think about parts, but it's important to start to think as a whole. That is Agenda 2030. Consider the context of their origin and transit in all dimensions. Next, please. Stop to analyze security, health, jobs, transportation. We need to start to think about synthesis. Their expectations and fears are readjusted as the journey progresses. Also, certainty is highly valued. This kind of exercises we used to do mostly of the time with all this administration per month. We used to work in different workshops with all the ministers. What kind of the decisions make the difference to other decisions in other ministers? Next, please. Stop about hierarchies. Start to networks. We need to start about networks. That is quite important in our government, in society, in all the organizations, private sectors, and academia. For us, it's quite important to understand that we are most at any sector, we are citizens of the world. So it is important to think about networks, not hierarchies. Next one. Stop to think about lineal. Start to think about not linear, because the life, our body, is a cycle. We need to think that our plans are a cycle. We used to do different exercise in Mexico with the Minister of Energy and the Minister of Health, and we talked to them about the mortality of the children. They start to think, what about mortality of children? I mean, I am the Minister of Energy. Yeah, but you know, what you do affects directly in the health of the children. Most of them, when they have born, because the air, the particulars are contaminated, so they are going to be with more problems, health problems. Next, please. So this is a general map about how we see the systemic approach of 2030 agenda. As you can see, the SDG 13, well, you can see just one point there, but if you do something about 13 SDG, you will have mostly of them like in a well, like in a waterfall. So let me tell you, we start to think how to plan with all the ministers about financial too, because we don't have enough budget. We are working with private sector too. But if we don't have enough budget, we don't have enough time, we need to think about systemic. We need to work together, and all the plans have to be together in mostly no more than 6 months. So this is the best idea we are working. We work with all the public services, but at the same time with academy, not NGOs, and society in general. So I invite you to start to work as a system, and with this important information, we will achieve in less time all the goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khumba. That was really a fantastic demonstration of a new way of approaching some of these problems. And I think it makes me think of these nature-based solutions, because if we turn more to those structures that have existed for millions of years, perhaps we'd have a lot of lessons to learn, such as this one. So thank you. And finally, we'll turn over to Ms. Rosala Khumba, who's, I was mentioning earlier, I've seen her name time and again in my email, and I'm just so happy that she's able to join us in New York. So you have the floor, Rosala.
Thank you very much. And I would want just to kick off with the presentation. As you have been told, I'm Rosala Khumba, working for or representing the stakeholders group on aging. And I have worked for some time for the most disadvantaged women and men across Africa, old and young, and they are consistently left behind. And they are not counted in data or statistics and in policy making. Exclusion of this segment of population is a major systemic barrier to SDGs implementation. Unless this changes, there is little hope to accomplishing the SDGs by 2030. People will still be left behind. From my perspective, working with the underprivileged, often forgotten segment of society that is considered of little value, mainly older person, but other groups like people with disability and indigenous communities, they are major systemic obstacle for fulfilling the promises we have made around sustainable development goals. I hope you can hear the voices of those being left behind through my intervention today. The key challenges are many, but I will give a few. One, unequal representation and participation in decision-making processes. The right to participation guarantees social inclusion and gives marginalized groups the opportunity to shape more inclusive policies. Shrinking space for citizens, particularly the most vulnerable groups, and civil society to engage in public policy further worsens the exclusion problem. Increasingly, there is need for us, especially the policymakers, to really understand the aspects around the underprivileged groups, especially people with disability, single mothers, aging, and we need to really to also support the underprivileged groups to really understand their rights and entitlements and how the government works so that they can effectively participate, demand for their rights, and also keep the government to account. Two, ongoing discrimination, harmful practices, abuse, and violence against the vulnerable groups continue to persist. As a result, majority of these groups experience high poverty levels and are unable to access the basic services such as health, employment, social protection, education, food, care, and housing. thereby also further increasing their vulnerability. Age discrimination, for example, is often present in legislation and public policy making, such as there is a mandatory retirement age limit, also age limits in medical insurance, or policies that stipulate age gaps on access to services. Governments must recognize this and take action against harmful practices and discriminatory attitudes such as ageism, early marriage, FGM, inheritance rights, witchcraft accusation, which continue to increase inequality among these groups. Thirdly, ignoring demographic trends is also a major challenge because one of the mega trends that have consistently been ignored when addressing SDGs is the fact that the world is aging. According to the UN demographic projection for 2019, by 2030, just 10 years away, people over 60 will reach 1.4 billion, representing 16.5% of our population. This is a 38.2% increase from 2019, which is staggering. Policymakers cannot ignore demographic trends and consequences when developing policies with a life course approach. Fourthly, lack of disaggregated data and limited scope of indicators to measure implementation of SDGs. It's important that current data collection methodologies, data collection tools, and analysis continue not to disaggregate data according to age, gender, and abilities. And this is also represented in data related around violence and abuse. It means that quite a number of segment of the society is left out, and as a result, the interventions, particularly policies, exclude them. The other issue is the lack of integrated life course approach by policymakers. It means that different population groups face intersecting forms of discrimination and inequalities that accumulate throughout their life cycle and have a negative impact on people as they grow older, particularly women. Similarly, age and disability have an effect on gender. So there will be need for us to understand all this and effectively design intervention that reflect this. Sixth, inadequate framework to integrate and mainstream key population groups in our day-to-day activities. It means that supportive frameworks, particularly legal, policy, and institutional programmatic framework, should be in place to provide direction to ensure that these groups, such as older person, disability, are considered and integrated as we do our plans, budgets, and programs, including sector planning process. The last, please give me a few minutes. The last systemic challenge is around the lack of high-level political commitment to adapt policies that increase inclusion, equity, and equality. In this respect, social protection flow that ensures income, security, and healthcare throughout the life cycle are widely recognized as one of the most effective measures to tackle poverty and inequalities, and also in terms of human development. In conclusion, there will be need for collective and multifaceted effort by human rights, development, and climate practitioners more than ever. And these practitioners should put more effort, particularly in creating synergies and collaboration between national and local governments, citizens, civil society, and private sector. Making the right choices depend on political will, well-resourced actions, and transparent and accountable efforts to identify, consult, and implement recommendations of the most marginalized person, child to older person, and in between. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So the hope is to have quite a bit of interaction, although I recognize that we only have about 15 minutes left. So if and when you contribute, if you could just please be respectful of the time so that we can hear more voices rather than fewer. And if you would like to speak, you may either raise your hand, which is a little more difficult for me, or push your little microphone-y button and it'll turn green. And that would be very helpful. Yes, thank you so much. Right over there to my left, please. Yes, it's red, so you go ahead.
Thank you. Great. My name is Buki Williams from Nigeria. I work for Education as a Vaccine. We work on the sexual and reproductive health and rights of adolescents and young people. And for me, what the panelists have been saying reminds me of an Audre Lorde quote, that we don't live single-issue lives. And I think that's critical for all of us as we work on these issues, that all of the issues we're working on are entry points into the lives of the people we work with, or even into our lives, and that it's important for us to be knowledgeable about this. And also I remember learning that economics is not just a technical process, it's politics, and it's about power. And often that power, we give it away as civil society because we don't understand how the macroeconomic frameworks work. Because looking at what Amelia was saying about how we're not investing in the Paris Agreement, but we're investing in fossil fuels. And that's being done in our name. And we also engage with that argument by saying, let's prioritize this, not that. Let's focus on adolescents and young people, not on the aged. Let's focus on other issues. So I think it's important for us, as civil society, to fight back against that and say that we can all work together so we can be intersectional in our own work, looking at gender, race, class, looking at all these issues and how it links. Because again, nobody lives single-issue lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There are now a number of hands. I don't want to discriminate against this side, but I saw Paul here. And here's what we're going to do. If you would like to speak, please raise your hands, and this is it. So we're going to go, I'm just going to number you. You have to remember your number. This is not your only chance to speak. We'll go Paul 1, because I already said his name. 2, 3, that woman. 4, that gentleman. 5, that gentleman in the back. 6, this woman. 7 here. 8 back there. 9 up here. 10 there. And if you take more than 1 minute, so help me, I'm going to cut you off.
But say so.
Please, go right ahead, Paul.
Thank you very much. I'm Paul Divakar, and I represent Global Forum on Discrimination based on Work and Descent, which is against casteism, against anti-gypsyism, and traditional and contemporary forms of slavery. Cutting across several nations in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Europe, we constitute around 260 million people, even more. And if we constitute together, we are the 7th largest nation in the world. However, what we'd like to bring, there are certain systemic obstacles that we have found in the HLPF process. Even though many of us face extreme forms of violence and our issues restrict our access to education and health and several others, the HLPF process has excluded these communities. It has not given an opportunity for us to articulate and also address these. The national action plans have failed to recognize these communities. And I'm especially referring to Bantu in Somalia and Haratim in Mauritania and Roma communities across Europe and the Dalits across Asia. And we feel that there are 3 areas that we would like you to look at this. One, in this next level of indicators, that there are ways in which you can address across, and also in the major groups and other stakeholders, they need to be recognized so that their voice can be heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's do one of these so we don't have the applause gap, if you don't mind. Please, right here. Have you pushed? No. It's the button that looks like a gentleman or woman with...
Thanks. My name is Sterling Dean, and I'm the chairman of the United Institutions Foundation. And I appreciate the opportunity to address this forum today. I'm going to speak about some of the systemic challenges that we are facing. International cooperation, good governance, accountable and transparent institutions, and inclusive societies serve as cornerstones for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, and sustainable peace. However, today we face a host of systemic governance challenges that are impeding progress on all issues, including climate change, poverty, gender equality, and biodiversity loss. Some of these systemic challenges are an overstretched global system, institutional silos, insufficient inclusion and participation, insufficient capacity and engagement on transboundary and international level issues, challenges in achieving policy coherence and integration across issues, threats to multilateralism, and financing for development. The urgency of our global crisis and the system-wide governance challenges we have call for an international community to put governance at the center of the global agenda and adopt a coherent global response and systemic approach to these issues, inclusive of national, regional, and international levels. We should base that on the same strategy called for in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on the means of implementation of the 2030 Agenda. To this end, our foundation has issued a policy brief outlining some practical recommendations on how such a response should be organized. And this would include the establishment of a UNGA open working group on governance reform to provide political guidance on that international level and establish a coherent international governance framework with goals, targets, and means of implementation aligned with existing agendas in the international commitments, similar to the open working group on the sustainable development goals.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Number 3 was here. This woman here. Half the time.
My name is Oluremi, and I represent United Family Mission. Hello. Oluremi, and I represent United Family Mission, and we are joining forces to eradicate poverty and hunger. And we believe that women and girls, and even children, there are unique power to reshape the society. And by touching this emotional chord within communities and investing in empowering women, we can truly impact the people, families, communities, and even countries and achieve this long-lasting benefit. And we also believe in the power of connected movement, which is helped sustainability by working with the local NGOs or an existing platform in every community, and making this will help meet with the people one-on-one, knowing what their needs are, rather than thinking about what their needs are or which way we feel we can help them. So I believe meeting them where they are and knowing their real need by working with an existing platform in the community will really help to be able to make this change we are looking for.
Thank you so much. Next, please.
Thank you so much. My name's Abel Koka. I'm working with Restless Development in advocating for government implementation of gender equality and sexual reproductive health and rights policies. And my point is on access to sexual reproductive and health services to young girls. And this has been a challenge in the community, and most of the reason which has been cited by the decision makers is lack of fund to allocate to those services. And as mentioned by Emilia, that more money are in the private sector than the public sector. I think we should find an entry point to convince the private sector to bring the money to support the public sector in investing on sexual reproductive health and right. Because the benefits is very high, we will reduce the maternal death, child mortality, but also the rate of teenage pregnancies and the consequences are very high. For instance, in Tanzania, 27% of adolescent girls between the age of 15 and 19 years old are already mothers or pregnant with their first child. And these girls are expelled from school the moment they get pregnant, and they're not allowed to go back to school. And how are we solving this? It's by making sure that they have access to sexual reproductive health and right. Also, the issue of child marriage is alarming. Once a girl is found pregnant, she is forced to go to the early marriage. How can we solve this? By making sure that they have access to sexual reproductive health and right. So I'm calling upon everyone in this room to make sure that we hold our decision makers accountable to walk their talk of making sexual reproductive health and right a reality, but also to find an entry point to convince those in private sector to bring the money to this area to support the girls. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Next, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Ahmed Chopon. I'm from Bangladesh. I work with the Civil Society organization. Its name is Voice. We know we are living in a world which is unjust and undemocratic. However, this is a democratic space where we can really speak out. The first point is the civil society organizations work by their own right, which is recognized in the Accra Action Agenda and the Busan Partnership Document. However, in the monitoring report, the last year, it was the third monitoring round, and we observed that from the government part, even from the development partners part, there is no compliance, and there is a little compliance, in fact, to create enabling environment and for the development effectiveness. The second, we know that the space for us, civil society, is shrinking. One, it is because of the legal instrument imposed by the state government. The second, due to the massive surveillance, which really, imposed the self-censorship. So on the both sides, whenever being a civil society organized, we have to be accountable in every steps, from the bottom to the top, to report. On the other hand, we are even under surveillance. It is globally, because the Civicus report, the World Bank report, and even the GPDC report, it provides the information, even from the Oxfam report, that we know that how, the state power is imposing to the civil society organizations. So to unlock, how we can really create a space that can help us to work collectively. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Who was next? It was this woman. Thank you.
My name is Emilia Efetimiki, and I'm the founder and CEO of Denis Miki Foundation. It's a non-profit organization in Cameroon. I want to address the areas of limitations as per financing of projects and activities by civil society organizations. If we look at the funding mechanisms, it's quite difficult for grassroots organizations. To get a grant or funding for your projects, you have to be qualified as an expert or an organization that has existed for more than 3 years. But then there are civil society organizations working at the grassroots doing amazing work, even just after the first 5 months, 6 months. So maybe there should be a remodeling of the financing system and also the budget lines, because most of funding is given to big organizations as per se, because there's a term saying expert organizations, organizations who have existed for over 30 years, 20 years. Those doing real work on the grass field don't get the access to the financing that is needed to do the work. And this is going to contribute a lot in changing the processes. So maybe there's a time where we need to reschedule or reform the way financing is done for programs and projects, both at the national and international levels. And this is going to help mostly the people working at the grassroots levels, civil societies as per religious groups, as per local meeting groups, and this will give us access to increase the impact and the values that we want to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you. Next was nearby. This, please. Very quickly. Thank you.
Can you hear me? I'm Aprajita Banerjee. I'm a researcher at University College Dublin, so my entire experience is from a very academic standpoint. So what I did in the past 1 year is to understand how different civil society groups and major group of stakeholders, like members of the major group of stakeholders in Ireland, think of engaging in the VNR process and in SDG implementation. And as a comment, or what I understood from the process is I saw that there is a lot of fragmentation in between the civil society groups, and I think there is a problem of collective bargaining in within the civil society. We are lacking that kind of a thing where we all look into our own personal agenda and then not come together and say that, okay, we are all together. We want this, as well as we will work with you on this. So both the things are missing. So that is my I wanted to share.
Thank you. In the back there was a woman. In a minute. There's a woman behind you first.
Much. Yeah, I didn't have a mic. Okay, yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm 100% convinced that we're not going to achieve the SDGs unless we really start working on systemic change. And we don't. And you can hear also these days, during all those meetings, everybody saying, all those world leaders saying what needs to happen and what must happen and what should happen, but they don't say how, and they don't say what their responsibility is. And I'm convinced that it's not only bad will, but they just don't know how to do it. Why are all CEOs in the world and all boards of companies being trained and coached, but ministers and governments aren't? And nobody is really taking this on. Well, I'm starting an initiative which is called Leadership for SDGs, and I would invite all of you to look at it on internet and tell me whether this is something that would be good for your government. www.leadershipforsdgs.org. And so we need to put that governance agenda to the center of the agenda, and tomorrow OECD and UNDP will launch a global governance hub at 8 in the morning, and Leadership for SDGs will be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, hi. My name is Christina Catalano. I am the founder and chairman of the Rise Anti-Bullying Initiative, and I wanted to make a quick comment regarding the locality of these initiatives. So we have all these ideals, and we have all these dreams of putting the SDGs into action. However, the local governments and the bureaucracy of them prevents that. For example, if you go to a local board of education, sometimes they reject initiatives even though they're benefiting from them and receiving government funding or any type of funding from them. We need to look into the actual regional and local governments and just counties and anywhere, areas that are actually going to be affected so we can make those changes in local ways.
Thank you. I believe there's one more, or no? No, we have no new ones, no new hands, just old hands. Yes, please.
My name is Jyotsna, and I'm representing Asia Development Alliance, which is a regional platform based in Asia. I'm very amazed and very happy to hear that this is the second SDG Summit and the first CSO Forum being held here in the UN headquarters. It's great to hear that the engagement of CSOs at the global level, but what we see missing is the same engagement level at the regional. It gets reduced. At the national and the local level, you hardly see any involvement. you see, especially in the VNR countries and the region that I belong to, Asia, especially Southeast Asia or South Asia, where there's hardly any engagement, especially very few countries. So how do we make it happen? I mean, we are talking about engaging governments, especially Goal 16 that talks about participatory decision making. So how do we make it happen? How do we make sure that the CSOs hold the government accountable first, and how the government also engage the CSOs, and they understand the same thing what we heard just now from the ADESA rep here, that CSOs have a great role to play in the capacity building, but here the governments are just not recognizing the role of CSOs. So I think it's very important. And my second point was localizing SDGs. Until we really think of localizing the SDGs, we see in some of the countries where the local level, they are producing VLRs, but I think it's it was a very good move, but my only thing that even localizing the SDGs 5 years down the line at the local level, people hardly know about SDGs, even at the line department. So I think we have a major role to play at the local level as well. But then my only worry, how do we get engaged? Because if they don't engage us, how do we hold them accountable? Thank you.
Thank you very much to those who have shared. This was a wonderful example of the starting point for what discourse looks like. I'm hoping that with the future panels, as we open up the floor, we can have a bit more discussion and interaction, because that is how we can sort of build a constructive coherence. So I thank all those who participated. Unfortunately, the panelists, I won't have time to come back to you, but you are able to raise your hands in future sessions, as you have heard, and engage in further dialogue. So I would ask now that those who are speaking on the second session come up as we offer our gratitude to those who spoke on the first one. Thank you.
So we're going to switch gears and start looking at what to do given what the world looks like. And I'd like to invite Daniela, Maria, and Annie to join me up here. Wonderful to have you here. And then we are missing Daniela.
So my name is Daniel. I could act as Daniela, but I feel as if that might not be appropriate. If Daniela could come up, that would be very helpful.
So while we're waiting for Daniela to join us up here, we are looking for concrete, constructive proposals as to how to unlock progress. And we're going to kick off with 3 interventions. We're very conscious of the fact that we do not have a member state as a panelist in this thematic panel, so I would really call on those member states in the room to consider joining the conversation. But we do have some very good speakers, so they are going to kick us off, and then we're going to open up again. And I do not see Daniela, so I'm going to radically start with the last name on the list and instead turn to Annie Namala, who is representing the People's Assembly here with us today. Please.
Thank you. Thankful for the major group to organize the session, but a little disappointed that we really do not have many states and UN representatives, because this we thought is really the forum where we can share with each other and listen to each other. It again becomes almost we are speaking to the same audience. So a little disappointed about that, and I hope really when we are talking of the Sustainable Development Goals, that the states and the UN agencies become a little more responsive to civil society engagement and discussions. Now, setting that aside, as you would sort of know, I represent the People's Assembly that's just taking place today and tomorrow in parallel to the General Assembly. So why do we feel the need for a People's Assembly? And I think all of us are very, very aware of the shrinking civil society space within our countries, in institutional spaces, within the UN, and even in a space like Sustainable Development Goals and the Summit, we do see that there is a shrinking space for civil society organizations. And that was the reason I think the global civil society organizations and people's movements came together to create the space called the People's Assembly. And I think today and tomorrow are 2 days when a number of issues are being discussed. And we have almost about 240 civil society organizations across the globe, from all the continents participating in discussions, real people's issues, real people who are struggling on the ground, and their strategies and recommendations are what we really hear. So why are we here? I think this, even as we speak of Sustainable Development Goals, we recognize it's a time of contradictions. It's a time of serious contradictions that we see today. As we speak of sustainable development, we have the world on fire, the Amazon on fire, literally and figuratively. When we are talking about people, we have large population groups that are left behind. We have refugees, migrants, trafficking. We have people who are in conflict areas while we speak about peace. So I think in some way, even on one hand, it looks like certain lollipops in the name of Sustainable Development Goals, which are being talked at one level, and we have a world which is really going on another level. So I think it is really time for us to recognize this contradiction and to address this together. I think that's a call that we have as we complete 4 years of the cycle, and we are here to review the mechanisms and the processes and the progress that we have made. I think at the end of 4 years, we do recognize that the VNRs that are being presented, the HLPF process, are really not up to the mark to review the Sustainable Development Goals. We are aware of how VNRs are being prepared in countries. We are aware of the limited space that other than governments, anybody has in that process. We are aware of the lack of any follow-up of that process in our countries, and we are very, very conscious of the way in which a 15-minute representation from the state with no discussions really have no solutions to the problems that we are talking about. And we really hope that the UN General Assembly at this time, with the SDG Summit, will take this into consideration and make this a much more of a robust, peer-reviewed process with a follow-up mechanism that we can have at the national level. And I think this is one recommendation that we as civil society would like to give to the UN agencies to make the VNR process and the HLPF process more robust. We are really seeing something of a multilateral governance system, if we can at all think about it. And are we serious enough of a multilateral governance system? When we can think of multilateral corporates in every other form, why is it that we are not able to think of a multilateral system in a governance perspective? And I think this is really the time that we can call upon that for a multilateral, genuine engagement. So the General Assembly is actually talking about a number of issues of climate justice. I would have my other colleagues who would sort of intervene and give us a little bit of a sense of what are the recommendations that are coming about. But I just want to list out some of the issues that are being struggled with and dialogued about. I think the struggle and the dialogue are both parts of the People's Assembly, where we are looking at climate justice, where we are looking at the communities that are discriminated on work and descent. We are looking at gender issues. We are looking at conflict, indigenous people, inequalities, land and agriculture. And tomorrow at 2 o'clock, we do have a people's action at the Dag Hammarskjöld. And I would really request all of you to be part of it, to be there, to listen to people from across the countries that have come to share their issues, to highlight and articulate the kind of issues. We did hear Emilia speak about how in the name of one thing, we are giving something by one hand, and we are taking away a lot of other things by the other hand. And I think this is what communities would really be sharing with us today, and we look forward to your presence. We have a few areas where we think the states and the UN need to really take action. One of the things that, discrimination is the most fundamental article of any of the conventions that we speak about, any convention. And we know today discrimination is increasing against communities, increasing against individuals, increasing against people. And I think the UN, if it really stands up to its name, has to take discrimination into account in everything that it does and really work towards an issue where we are able to address discrimination in all kinds of areas. I think that's really something up to the UN, more than even the individual governments, I would say, up to the UN to really put its principle and policy in place. A second dimension that we would really like is disaggregated data. We know that countries do not collect data on vulnerable communities. Countries do not present this data. None of the VNR talks about vulnerable communities or discriminated people. And we really feel that we need to have disaggregated data. We look forward in this citizen-generated data because there's a lot of countries where citizens are collecting data, and we hope the states would sort of see a mechanism in which the citizen-generated data and the state data can really be synchronized and taken forward. So we really see that as an area that we want to be taken forward. And we would like every state to map its vulnerable communities and to report on its vulnerable communities and the inequalities between them and the national averages. We would like this to be reported in the VNRs as a mandatory report, just as you would report on gender or child or something like that. As a mandatory report, this has to be done as part of the VNRs, and we really look forward to this. And the other thing we also look forward is, I know we have all the 5 Ps and everything that we talk about, but to really keep people at the center, and we don't see any of them in action. People at the center of this whole thing, and we don't think this accelerated implementation and technology is going to solve the system, but really keeping people at the center and their issues and having genuine dialogues would really be the way forward for us. And in that, we recognize the need for specific targeted actions for vulnerable communities and to move forward along that. I know my time is up. Thank you so much, and look forward to a discussion on this.
Thank you so much, Annie. So I've been informed that we got it all wrong. Daniela is not at all supposed to be speaking on behalf of Together 2030. Apologies for that. And instead, I'd like to invite John Patrick Ngoy to join us up here. While he finds his space up here on the podium, I would like to turn to our next speaker, that is Maria Auma. As some of you know, youth organizations, students, children and young people have been leading the way on much of the SDGs, and particularly the climate mobilization. And Maria will speak on behalf of the Major Group of Children and Youth, please.
Thank you, Antonia, and greetings to everyone. My name is Maria Auma from BLI Global, Yango, and I'm speaking on behalf of the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, the formal self-organized mechanism for the meaningful participation of young people at the UN. We are desperately off track to meet the SDGs. It is an intergenerational injustice and an existential crisis. The collective failure to accelerate progress on SDGs is a crime against humanity, against all life, the planet, and the future. We need to stop, rethink our systems, realign our values, and enact structural reforms. We have aspirations, but no compass to keep ourselves accountable. We live in a digitally connected society, but disconnected from realities on the ground. The paradox of our time is that we have more knowledge, but less judgment and means to implement the solutions derived from our knowledge. We have more experts, but fewer solutions. Guided missiles, but misguided decision makers. There is more capital, but in the hands of the privileged few. Our obsession with growth and profit is accelerating our march to our demise and extinction. Over the past year, a series of grassroots climate movements, like the climate strikes, has put the climate crisis at the forefront of the conversation. This has been crucial for communities to take ownership of SDGs and keep their governments accountable. Young people are taking the lead on sounding the alarm that climate change is a global crisis. We are demonstrating that it is possible to unite under one cause, irrespective of our differences. The only boundaries the rest of the world seem to transcend are those of the planet's ecosystems, and we need to take this seriously. This is not empty noise. This is a strong, steady, and resounding message to act now. We remind governments not to let their engagement in the UNGA and the Climate Action Summit be the end of accelerating climate action. And so we have a few recommendations that we would like to share. First, reform SDG follow-up frameworks to include major groups and other stakeholders at all stages of the process, including preparation of VNR reports. Imagine if we had an independent review panel of rights holder groups assess the quality of the VNR process and reporting before they are allowed to be showcased at the HLPF. Imagine the impact that would have. Secondly, we call upon member states to urgently update their nationally determined contributions by 2020 towards pathways of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, reflecting principles of intergenerational equity. Tackling this challenge requires unprecedented cooperation beyond our current paradigms of global governance and enact a global commons approach. We must stop operating in silos and stop ignoring emerging issues before they become emergencies. While we are still negotiating about adaptation efforts and what it will take to de-risk investments, there are islands such as Abaco already being devastated by hurricanes, leaving communities and families homeless. Thirdly, although often ignored, we as rights holders, social movements, civil society need to continue to demonstrate what the world can be. We are not naive about the lack of global political will. A lot rests on our shoulders and lies on our hands. Let's continue to engage in dialogue. Build from traditional and indigenous knowledge, apply the science policy interface, organize in community action, and build an alternative to failing systems around us. The fires ravaging in Amazon, Angola, California, Congo, and around the world are real. And those toxic pollutants will remain in our atmosphere long after this generation is gone. This is a crisis which does not end with me and you. This is a crisis we are passing on, something bigger than our entire generation, and it needs to be tackled that way. And while the G7 spends approximately a combined $890 billion annually on its military budget, it could not even muster up the $20 billion needed for the Green Climate Fund in 5 years. Need I say more to highlight the insincerity of governments to tackling pressing challenges? For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And the more you deny your right, the more we as youth will rise up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. I think there was two things that Maria said that I think should guide us in the conversation that we're about to kick off. She asked us to fight the silos, and she asked for dialogue. Let's see if we, as a room, as a gang having come together here today, can make this debate more interactive, one that is fighting silos in a more active way than we may do generally. So I'd like you to listen to one another, engage with what you hear, engage with what you've heard from Annie, from Maria, ask questions from each other. It's not every day we get to come together like this. So, who's going to start? Ooh, loads of hands. I think... True, we did that before. Thank you, Job. So, we're going to start there.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rebecca Nelson, and I am here representing my organization, America Solidaria, but also Volunteer Groups Alliance. And I feel like it's a moment where we can highlight a path forward for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals through volunteering. It's not something that we've heard talked about very much in this space, but I think it's something that holds a lot of possibility precisely for not treating the individual SDGs in isolation, but rather achieving a more holistic approach. And I feel like the volunteer sector is one that often gets praised as nice, but not very often taken seriously. But last year, UN volunteers estimated that there were 1 billion volunteers serving globally. And that ranges from informal volunteers who are helping their neighbors to recover from the effects of climate change, for example, to disaster volunteers who are responding to accelerating environmental crises, and volunteers who are also building community capacity and resilience. So volunteering doesn't only impact all of the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's also shown to make people more civically engaged and informed. So, for example, we had a group of teenage girls from Quetzaltenango, Guatemala, who started volunteering with underage mothers to help them grow professionally and as the subjects of human rights. This volunteer initiative gathered force until they were serving 62,000 underage mothers. And through our Concausa program, they were able to speak directly with the vice president of Guatemala and share their concerns. So volunteering can also be a channel for sharing concerns and voices. However, volunteering often is under-recognized, and so we would call on member states, if there were any present, but also perhaps in our United Civil Society Declaration, to measure the impact of volunteering in their voluntary national reviews and support volunteering programs financially, also creating a public policy infrastructure that enables volunteering as part of their national plans for implementing the 2030 Agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I have a gentleman here. No, so it's the big one with like a mouth that is somehow speaking, yeah? It needs to get red before we can hear you. If you raise your hand, the system will...
Okay, thank you. My name is Plamen Stoyanov. I'm from Žika, Bulgaria. I'm not going to talk. I'm just trying to ask you, because I'm asking myself and I'm not finding the answer. I heard some keywords also from your side, from the moderators, and as well some of the speakers. For me, very important was networking, fragmentation. It's good that here, from this group, from the civil society, there are people coming from working in different areas. Everyone has found its niche and working there. But if we don't align our vision in one direction, there was some doubts about if the goals will be achieved. And also the question of this respectful lady, why, in the beginning you mentioned, here is the civil society organization, the other three components, private sector, academia, and youths. these three are not part of the civil society, why they are not present. And in this leaflet, there are three forums: regional government, civil society, and business. How we will know what is thinking the business? How we will know what the governments, local governments are thinking if we don't share, if all these three big forums don't align their vision? The global goals will be very, very hardly achieved.
I really want to thank the representative of Bulgaria for challenging us and for asking questions that will help us move this conversation forward. And I'd actually want to pick up on one of your questions because I think there are business representatives in the room. So I'd like to call on the major group of thanks. Business and industry.
I am Roberto Suarez, representing the Business and Industry Group and representing the International Organization of Employers. My first point is related precisely, I would like that to be a dialogue, and this dialogue is not just among ourselves, it's also with government. And I thank the representative of Bulgaria for taking the floor, because that's really, in reality, what we need. I don't know who said that we are not here because we are activists, but because we are actionists, because we want to undertake action. That's precisely what we want to take. We are representing business around the world in more than 150 countries, and what we see is small and medium companies struggling in an incredible manner just to have their business done in a decent manner, with corruption, with bureaucracy, with lack of incentives, with inefficiency, and they are doing that in a kind of hero approach sometimes. We need, I don't know who said that we need a systemic change, and that's what these companies are asking us. We need a change of regulations. We need a change also of the policies, and we cannot do that. And that's my main message to all of you. If you do not help us with your activism, but with your action-oriented approach, sometimes we find ourselves like struggling with institutions, with regulations, and also with governments that do nothing, and we cannot provide the results that we need to do, but we need to have in the very short term. So we are willing here to engage with you in an effective manner. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you, and I see a lot of hands. And I'm going to start here in a spirit of fairness, and with the gentleman over there, and then we'll continue the woman next to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Richard Sewakirianga. I'm the Executive Director of the Uganda National NGO Forum. I think the question for this session is really about how do we unlock the progress? What are the key proposals to unlock progress? I think from the last panel, what we had are three very interesting things: that the Global South is subsidizing the North and everybody else. We also heard that we need to network, and that we are not doing enough to be inclusive. I think from what we now see from those three is that in terms of unlocking progress, we have to really think about what does it mean in terms of what we do when we say the Global South is subsidizing everyone else. What that may mean is that we have to do some work around exactly how we share the burden of everything that we are dealing with. That even this leave no one behind that we've talked about, it's very highly likely that those who are behind are being left behind systemically. It's not because they are supposed to be behind. And so we must do something around that. I think on the other point on networking, it's key. The dialogue, as people have said, is clear. We must do a lot in terms of even speaking in different ways. I'm one of those people who think that if there are no member states, I think everybody from here who is seated here comes from some member state. We can talk as citizens who pay tax and not wait for those who have sirens in front of them to speak for us. And lastly is an issue around inclusion. I'm going to use an example which may be a bit tricky, but which I think is important. That if you look at this program, there are two names that appear 5 times, meaning that we have 2 people who are doing a lot of work, and we have over 500,000 civil society organizations around the world. Now, that may be because of logistical reasons, but that tells you about how we practice what we preach, which means that we have to have taken time to look for people so that you have a deep diversity even in our own program, because that's the action that we are calling everybody to take. Thank you very much.
Fair point. We hope we'll see you in the planning committee for the CSO forum next year. Huh? I'd like to invite the woman next to you to, yeah, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Chantal Omuhoza from Rwanda, working with Spectra, a young feminist organization. In terms of just a few, I have like 3 or 4 quick suggestions on how some of the key proposals. And the first one is I want to focus how we really need to confront and accept that the reality of neocolonialism that exists, and how we need to be real that most of our leaders, their hands are tied because they also have to be influenced or have to get conditions from elsewhere. And therefore, we also need to confront this, the geopolitical relations that are between the global north and the global south. And this is something that we need to do if we need to really get the agenda moving. This needs to be addressed, and we need to have these discussions here in the UN, but also in our national spaces. The other one is how we also need to make a shift in how we measure progress. Why do we continue measuring progress in terms of the GDP? How do we continue measuring progress in terms of the number of buildings, the number of infrastructures, instead of measuring progress in terms of how the lives of the people that we serve have changed? So there's already, if you're working towards being measured in a way that is wrong, it means you cannot even get there you cannot get where you're supposed to be. So we also need to make a shift in how we measure progress. And the other one is how we, as civil society organizations, we need to increasingly be in the spaces of macroeconomic policy making, and here is to work directly or be in spaces where the World Bank, for instance, the IMF and other institutions that set policies that are implemented in our countries that sometimes keep the status quo the way it is, does not make any transformation. So therefore, if we're not in these spaces or if we're not confronting these institutions that set the agenda, we are doomed and we're not going to make any progress. And the last one is on private sector. We're hearing we need to partner, we need to work together, but we need to be real that private sector is about profit making. And increasingly, we're seeing that most of our states are prioritizing profit over people in every aspect, in agriculture, in other projects, in education, in social protection, in social services. Everything is being prioritized, and this comes at a cost, and this increases inequalities. So the SDG agenda needs to confront what are the limits of the private sector contribution, and how do they comply and not go beyond the human rights standards that are already in place. Private sector needs to contribute, yes, everybody needs to contribute because everybody's a citizen, but there has to be lines that needs to be drawn. And this relationship between the state and the private sector needs to be really clear and transparent. Thank you.
Thank you. There's the microphone is green there in front of you. Please go ahead.
The dialogue has made me remember about the voluntary things too. Thank you for the first responses. I am Safina from Migrant Care Indonesia, work for the woman migrant worker issue. We did analyze and synthesize our trend analysis issue on our voluntary review document made by our CSO organically. And the rest we seen on the document is the interlinkage from the one goal to another, which the ethically consequences by to recognize it was to push to create the disaggregated data that tools to push the public policies and social policies to be better and to unlock the things that we discussed today. The big 4 issues, as seen not only for the migrant issues, is the feminizations of migrations, highlighting the structural poverty and violence to women, safe migration, human trafficking, and rights to information. Those things will only seen with the strong feminism outlook and the human right-based approach which it will get more stronger if the CSO and other stakeholders working along together without exception. As SDGs Zeitgeist has trying to help us, all the women in the world, to naming and to unlock the quote-unquote the problem that has no name. Thank you.
Thank you. We have about 10-15 minutes left of this segment, as it was planned in the agenda. And I see a lot of hands. We're, of course, keen on making sure that we hear from as many as possible. So if we could aim at being super focused, I think we will be able to cover most of those who would like to speak. I'm going to start at the very back up there, because that little side there has been has been marginalized so far. So please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Felipe from Argentina. I'm from the Latin American Campaign for Education. And I wanted to talk a bit about one of the things that the representative of the People's Assembly said. She said she was disappointed because of the lack of states representatives. And while I totally agree and there should be more states representative, I'm also disappointed because there are not young representatives of CSO activities and CSO organizations. I'm 18 years old, and I don't think that there is one other under 20 activist in this room right now. I find that really worrying, especially when talking about solutions for the SDGs and how to achieve progress, because talking with youth, as one of the panelists in the last forum said, one of the keys to achieving the SDGs is to talk with all the groups there are. And youth is one of the most important groups, because we are the ones that not only will live, but at this point will probably suffer the inability of governments to achieve the SDG goals. So what I'm asking for is to engage youth, to end with this false correlation between experience and knowledge, and to sit down and talk so we can have a better world. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to do the two people here in the very front. I'm coming to you. If we start with you, and then.
My name is Zainab, and I'm representing the Alberta Council for Global Cooperation. But at the same time, I'm representing the People's Assembly right now, and I'm going to share a little bit about the things that we talked about during our session today. The first is to define the reality that we live in. So the reality that we live in, democracy is shaken globally. Our youth around the world have easier access to violence than they do to education. Where conflict and war have become transboundary crises, they bleed over borders. Where individual nations and their allies are more focused on state security than the security of their people. The world's most marginalized people, where women are always at the top of the list, are always given an informal seat at the table during peace processes when they are actually more or equally affected by the baseless violence. The correlation between national trends of gender inequality and conflict is undeniable. So in this reality, where conflict is the norm, our first and foremost step should be to realign our paradigms and worldviews with the SDGs. The first of which is, specifically in the context of peace and conflict, is to define SDG number 16 within the context of each specific nation. The second is to give everyone a seat at the table. We spoke a little bit about dialogue. So we need to be less prescriptive and more two-sided conversations. And the final is to evaluate our leaders through the SDGs. If we're consistently worried about our leaders not doing anything about the SDGs, we need to look at them critically through the paradigm of the SDGs before we put them into power. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the gentleman next to you.
Thank you very much, Antonia. My name is Claudio Fernandez. I represent Gestos, an NGO from the northeast of Brazil, and also the Brazilian Working Group for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. I'm going to talk about two things that came out. One is lines to be drawn. The lady on my left talked about it. And also the systemic structural change that is necessary. So I'm just going to highlight 4 quick points to unlock the process, which will be to unlock the financing for sustainable development process. So the first point is progressive taxation, because regressive taxation is creating more inequality, so that's a market failure being led by governments. So point 1, progressive taxation. Point 2, international solidarity levies on financial transactions. Even if the US is against that, Japan is for it, France is for it, so we can build a coalition of countries that can mobilize those resources that can be applied to the issues that we talked about. Third one, capital control and macroprudential regulation. Somebody talked about macroeconomics, for instance. If we do not control, the illicit financial flows are just going to keep on coming out of Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and all the other countries, and subsidizing the rich and the luxury of the world. And to finish, the fourth point, which would be to finally agree on the binding agreement on corporations and human rights. Because if corporations keep on defining the human rights in the locations, the Amazon is going to still be burning, the mine is going to still be built, and everything else. Thank you.
Thank you. And turning to this side, and the woman with the blue T-shirt, please.
Thank you. I'm waiting. Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Gabriela Harabanyova. I'm coming from the European Roma Grassroots Organization Network. We are based in Brussels. We are a network that advocates for the better policies for Roma in Europe, and we combats anti-Gypsyism, which is a specific form of racism against Roma. When it comes to the fragmentation, I think that we actually did a very big step these days. We get together several communities. They are kind of facing the same fate, which is the DWD communities, those discriminated based on the work and descent, casteism, but also the traditional and contemporary forms of slavery. We got together, we are trying to get our voice together to actually address better the international fora, especially the UN. And I think that, you know, such a step, it's important actually to have our voice heard, to be engaged in all those processes which are related to us. Because most of the SDGs we actually we should be using for our communities, but we are not. There is a lack of plans. The national plans, when it comes to our communities, are almost non-existent. And if they are not implementing. So we need to actually have our governments to have the national plans with specific indicators. So we need specific indicators and disaggregated data when it comes to our communities, but we also need to push the implementation. So and the progress can be done only with us, and I think that that's being heard, that we hear it in this room a lot, but only with us together and with different stakeholders from the local, national to up to the regional and international level. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And then the gentleman next to you there. Yeah.
My name is Ibrahim Ramdan from Mauritania. I'm fighting against slavery in Mauritania. And I'm also a member of DWD, working to end discrimination based on work and descent, casteism, anti-Gypsyism, contemporary, and traditional slavery, because traditional slavery still exists in Mauritania. So I have a question. Why we are here? Who is listening to us? The president of our country. We are suffering from them. They should listen to us. We have to ask the UN that the representative of our government come to listen to us. Because we are suffering from them. We in the civil society, we are volunteer, and they are employed for the purpose. So they have to come and listen to us and listen to our sufferance. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then there's a gentleman behind. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Hello. Hi, thank you very much. My name is Zhou Xuming. I'm from China, but today I'm here representing Yeshiva University. So all the time I have been thinking about the 3 questions. I wish I could have had the answers at some point of my life, but very unfortunately I haven't yet. So now I'd like to share the questions with all of you. So first of all, how to engage governments, especially governments of powerful countries, to take substantial actions to change the world. And by powerful countries, I mean countries with experiences and abilities to solve global issues, such as climate crisis. As we all know, the president of the most powerful country on this planet withdrew from Paris Climate Agreement 2 years ago. And I don't want to name either the president or the country to show respect. So what can civil society do to make their governments to spend more money and human resources on issues like humanitarian aid delivery and environmental protection rather than military defense or trade war? And the second question, how to engage governments not just to take substantial actions, but to take effective and efficient actions when it comes to issues concerning everyone. And we don't want to see senators or congressmen spending a whole month and get dressed up in the conference room discussing, debating, or even arguing about what to do for their own political benefits, but not for the benefits of people in general. And the third question, since I am a young man, I have been thinking about how to empower young people who have no political power, but full of energy, strong sense of social responsibility, and a strong desire to change the world. And how can the international community work together to create a platform for young people like us to do whatever the world hopes us to do? Because we are not just now, we are also the future of this planet. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the woman here. I'm sorry, but there was somebody else who...
My name is Toni Antonucci, and I'm representing the International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics, but I'm also a lifespan developmental psychologist, so I want to address the issues from that perspective, specifically on how to unlock progress. I think that the first thing to do is, and I think this is what we're talking about, is to be as practical as possible. And I recognize that we have the SDGs, which the goals are wonderful, and many people in this room, probably everyone in this room recognizes them, but I think we have to translate them into a way that people who are in powerful positions realize that they're relevant to them and relevant to the goals that they believe in. So, for example, unlocking and educating women and girls increases and educating all members of a society increases the progress of that society, and it increases its economic development. I think making that kind of translation will be very important. Someone earlier on mentioned that there are many experts and there are many answers we already have, but we haven't figured out how to apply them. I'm an academic, a lifelong academic, and I recognize it's a disease of impracticality, but I think we can cure people by bringing groups together at a multidisciplinary level and having them translate to practical goals, such as how educating people increases the economic development of a country. I'd like to also mention that we need to bring all parties together in a practical way, in an interdisciplinary way, in a multidisciplinary way, and have all of those parties recognize the importance of bidirectionality, that we can learn from each other from different countries, different regions of the world, different disciplines, and even different goals to achieve the goals of interest. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the woman there in the back.
Thank you very much for this opportunity and very interesting participations. I am coming from Indigenous Peoples and Indigenous Women Movement, and I want to share with you that we are continuing independent agenda, but we need to be recognized as people's subject of rights. That's the meaning that we need the place to participate with our proper voice and from our perspective, contributing to the solution. We are, in many countries, we are not recognized still in the Constitution as peoples, but we are very sure that we give many resources and richness as cultural in each country where we are, and we need to be recognized as that kind of people with capital. We have many initiatives from our perspective, from our capability, and from our resources, and trying to contribute to the economic development of our countries. When the young person from China talk about what we can do, we need respect and dialogue, an horizontal dialogue to share our knowledge and the strategies to develop the economy in our country, not only people in the power deciding. About the business, we need that the business people need to ask to the governments to have, for example, the recognition from indigenous people about the consult, because we have the right to decide what we want and how we can contribute to the economic activities is realized in our countries. Thank you very much, my Spanglish, but I think that you understand something.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'm actually going to wrap up this segment, because we would like to have time to go into our third and last segment that will look at how we can make sure that progress is made. So we would like to thank Annie and Maria for kicking us off, and we would like to thank all of you for your contributions. For those of you who didn't get to speak yet, thanks for your patience. There's a new round coming up. And Dan, I think you're on.
Thank you so much. I think a round of applause is in order as we transition to the next panel. Thank you so much. So it will be wonderful to have Tove Riding come on up, and along with Ms. Christina Galak and Ms. Joan Carling. Hi, Tove. So as we have thus far gone through, I mean, so let me start by saying there are many, many people in the room, many voices, and we are trying our best to hear as many as we can, and we're trying to reduce the number of transitions and all of this in order to allow for your voices to be heard, but that also requires very much patience. So I apologize that we can't hear everybody, but I do hope that you will forgive us and know that we are always willing to be in touch by email or any other way so that your contributions can still be heard in written form. I don't blame the panelists for sitting as far away from me as possible. I would do the same. But it's wonderful to have the three of you here. We've heard quite a bit over the course of the 2 hours about some of the systemic challenges that we're facing as a global society, and then some interesting opportunities and different ways of thinking about the future and what is necessary to really overcome these challenges. And I'm looking forward to hearing from the three of you regarding some of these institutional arrangements. So we have the concepts, we have many of the ideas. What does it look like to actually put this into practice? And I'm very excited to have the three of you here, each for different reasons that I could speak about for hours, but I will save all of you guys the flattery. So we'll turn first to my dear friend Tove.
Well, a warm thank you for the invitation, and warm thanks to all of you for spending the evening with us. My name is Tove Riding. I'm probably on this panel because I've been hanging around the United Nations for too long. I used to work on climate and development and biodiversity protection. And 6 years ago, I switched to working on money because money was the one issue that never seemed to get properly addressed in the UN commitments and decisions. So I'll get back to how it's going with fixing that part of the United Nations. But first to say, obviously 2015 was a year of government promises and handshakes and family photos and champagne. And now we're in the hangover phase. It's very obvious that it was a lot easier to sit on the podiums and talk about what needs to happen in 15 years. Most of the leaders were pretty sure they were not in office at that point anymore. And it's always easier to talk about how the world should look in 15 years rather than talking about, so what do we do now? What do we commit to now? But of course, we're civil society. It's our job to raise the difficult questions. And there are a few very, very key things that we need to make sure that the 2030 agenda doesn't become something that governments start thinking about in 2019. The first thing is absolutely vital also for us in this room. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that every year in the lead up to 2030, we are holding governments to account. This goes for the national level. The international community actually has an obligation to ensure that it is safe to be active civil society at the national level, to be a journalist, to follow up on government commitments. It also goes internationally. I'm very happy to hear that we should consider the United Nations our home. I'm a bit sad that we have to show our passport 5 times to get into our home. I'm also not too happy about the fact that there seems to be an awful lot of rooms in our homes where we are not welcome. And lastly, when we want to talk to the other people that live in this home, our governments, we have to ask for permission, and often we get a no. I think it was a very good question, are the governments willing to listen to us? So that's the first level, and that is absolutely vital for the 2 other levels. The first one is, of course, national action, making sure that governments follow up nationally. But even that is very related to the last level, which is international action. If the decisions from 2015 are the only documents that we have, we will not make the progress we need. Those decisions have to be supported by further commitments. And let's remind ourselves that this building here is not about giving fluffy speeches and governments doing voluntary self-reporting on what they think they're good at home. This building is actually about international negotiations, international commitments to solve global problems. And God knows there are a lot of problems that they could be working on. So let's remember that we can actually demand that governments sit down and find solutions to global problems. This includes demanding legally binding agreements. I think we talk too little about the fact that we can demand agreements that need to be ratified at the national level, that need to be implemented. These agreements can include rights. It can include rules. It can include protection of communities and peoples and individuals. It can include regulation of multinational corporations and so forth. It can also include monitoring and follow-up, and God knows we need that. So let's remember also that in the history of the United Nations, these different things have often worked together. We even have examples of legally binding agreements that were negotiated in a negotiation where civil society and the indigenous peoples were not only allowed in the room, we had a microphone. We could make interventions in the negotiations at any point, and if our proposals were supported by one member state, the text would go into the legally binding agreement. So we need to make sure that we remember that we can use this body for much more than governments would like to use it for. And in terms of this talk about the crisis of multilateralism, let's make sure that doesn't become an excuse for governments to not find global solutions. Some of the best international agreements we have were agreed during periods where there was large groups of governments that were severely difficult. We're back in that scenario, but that doesn't mean that all the other governments don't have a responsibility. And lastly, just a comment on the money side. We're also part of the CSOs for FFD group. And well, the United Nations has become the place where you commit to saving the climate and the planet, ensuring gender equality, fixing healthcare, fixing education, and getting rid of poverty, but you're not allowed to talk about money. How would that ever work? So what we are trying to bring up here in the UN is that we need international agreements that also address the money side. Because if you look at where the money is going, it's not trickling down, it's trickling up. It's trickling from poor to rich, both in terms of countries and in terms of individuals. And that is, in essence, the opposite of what the Sustainable Development Goals are about. So there are a number of areas where we need international agreements. It goes on fulfilling the financial commitments that have been made over decades. It is in terms of preventing that when a country goes into debt crisis, suddenly the country has to pay rich creditors instead of ensuring human rights and basic public services for its people. And it also goes when it comes to stopping international tax avoidance and evasion. The world's largest multinational corporations and richest individuals have found a way to buy themselves out of the tax system. Right now, there is a demand within this body to have an international UN negotiation to address these issues. Unfortunately, we have a minority of governments that are blocking progress. So this is just to say that we as civil society have a lot of homework to do, but we also have a lot of great examples of how when we work together, we can really make things happen in this building. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tove. I will just say that that's one letter off from love. So, you know, I really appreciate your comments. And then we'll turn to Ms. Christina Galak. Of course, she's no stranger to these hallowed halls. It's wonderful to have you with us. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm truly honored to be part of this panel and to share some of the thoughts with you all. You are right that I've been in many occasions in this room addressing different groups, and always has been super energizing, and I've learned a lot from all of you. So now I'm going to talk to you about a story of vision, engagement, and action, which I think are the three words that define the approach of the Spanish government, the one that I represent, and the one I'm proudly to head the High Commissioner's Office. Why vision, why engagement, and why action, and why I'm addressing this to you, representatives of the civil society. First of all, because we have embraced the 17 SDGs in the 2030 agenda as our framework for public policies that shape the transformations that our government is decided to do, and that we look at this in a coherent manner and we don't make a difference on what is internal policies or foreign and external action. Second, the engagement. We have engaged with our society through a national plan that was in fact presented in this room in July 2018. And this plan is our guiding route. And in fact, tomorrow we will be presenting our first year of implementation because we take it very seriously what has been mentioned before, which is accountability and which is ensuring that our actions are transparent, and through the engagement with the civil society, we make progress. And the third, which is action. Action in terms of how do we assemble our public steps, laws, decisions, the action through municipalities and regional governments with the civil society. And here, another point very clear, we are convinced that there is no transformation that can lead to the realization of the 2030 agenda unless the civil society is part and parcel of this project. So one of our first steps was to constitute a council for the sustainable development, which is integrated by representatives of all parts of our civil society, from the business organizations, trade unions, to NGOs that are linked to cultural, NGOs that are linked to social economy, NGOs that are mobilizers in abroad through actions in countries that have support, or organizations that are platforms that encompass all those that care for the ones left behind, organizations of the civil society that care for people with that need a special support, etc., etc., etc. 50 representatives of platforms that themselves gather other platforms, and so we have built a mechanism for dialogue with the civil society. So we are truly in the path of not only sharing the experiences but working together. And in fact, part of the mobilization we are doing is to ensure that civil society organizations themselves are engines for transformation. You know, we are convinced that through public policies there is no achievement, so we need the others, and we try to build all the efforts together. Last, a reflection. We were just in a room next door, in the trustees' room, this afternoon, listening to the Secretary General on his plea for action and his conviction that we need an acceleration. For us, the acceleration will come through the pressure, the transition, the transformations that the civil society will also bring, and that will ensure that the governments act. And the three words, the progress that has to be faster, the ambition that has to be higher, and the action that has to be more efficient are three words and three adjectives that we fully recognize and to which we are fully committed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I think it's quite fitting that we have representatives from the indigenous population sort of close off this formal segment. It's so important to ensure that we hear the voices of that community who has so much to offer in terms of vision and history. So thank you so much
Good evening. I was actually asked to present the key recommendations on the reform of the HLPF. But I want to check with the audience on, can you raise your hands, please, of those who have attended any HLPF session, the high-level political forum? Oh, okay. At least half of the room. Not bad, not bad. Okay, since that's the topic that I'm assigned, I will actually share to you some of the agreements or the position paper of the steering committee of the major groups, because we have been working on the reform of the HLPF since before the July HLPF last year. So what I will present is more the key principles that we are proposing to make the HLPF more relevant, so to speak. But to start with, let me just define what is the aim of the HLPF, and again in line to what was mentioned earlier, whether for us to review whether it's actually doing its objectives or not. So the high-level political forum is intended to provide political leadership, guidance, and recommendations for sustainable development, follow up and review progress in the implementation of sustainable development commitments, enhance the integration of the 3 dimensions of sustainable development in a holistic and cross-sectoral manner, and have a focused, dynamic, and action-oriented agenda, ensuring the appropriate consideration of new and emerging sustainable development challenges. So for those who have attended the HLPF, have you experienced this? Did you see the spirit of the aims of the HLPF taking place? Like, it's action-oriented, there's political leadership, there's dynamic. All right. Okay. No, that's why we need to strengthen how it's being done, to make it live up to the objectives, but also to ensure that it is catalyzing and facilitating transformative actions and accountability and stronger global cooperation, because that's what we need. That's what we need to achieve the SDGs. So in line with this, there are 4 key areas of principles that's being proposed to make the HLPF more relevant and in line with its own aims. First is accountability and analysis of the root causes and systemic determinants. This is how to make the HLPF more substantive in discussing and addressing the structural barriers of why we are lagging in the first place, of why we are not achieving the goal. So there has to be honest conversations on what are the obstacles and how do we address these obstacles. And that should include issues, as already mentioned, in equitable global economic, trade, monetary, and financial structures, because these are the ones driving inequality, and yet nobody wants to talk about inequality. Everybody says there is inequality, but no action, no discussion on actions to address inequality. So that's a critical issue. And also, it should provide for spaces to redirect and redesign public policies, programs, investments, in order to accelerate progress where it existing, identifying and addressing gaps in implementation, and effectively responding to the analysis of the root causes of lack of progress. Because it's not enough to say we lack progress, but we're not addressing why we are lacking progress in the first place. And lastly, also to mention that it should, there should be an emphasis on policy coherence with human rights, social equity, and a holistic approach to sustainable development imperatives. Because as you know, the discussions are always siloed. We discuss one SDG and the other SDG, but they are all interlinked because of the common challenge or the common structural barriers. You cannot talk of poverty without also talking about what? Yes, exactly. So that's what we need to surface. How are we addressing the interlinkages of these different goals in a way that there is policy cohesion to move forward, not just with one goal, but the multiple goals are being addressed. So that's another. So that is one that is needed in terms of the reform or the kind of discussions, thematic discussions that has to happen to avoid siloing the issues that we really need to grapple with. Second is the equitable inclusion and participation, and this is how we make the HLPF more inclusive, particularly of representatives of marginalized groups, and especially rights holders and those furthest left behind. Like as mentioned earlier, if this is our home, then why are we not given the space to express our views and engage in a meaningful and constructive dialogue to address our own issues, how our rights are being fulfilled, and our own aspirations are integrated in the implementation of the SDGs. So that kind of inclusion is needed, especially in the context of leaving no one behind. So far, this is just a lip service. The leaving no one behind. We don't even identify those who are left behind. We always just call them vulnerable groups. And I am an indigenous person. I belong to a community. We need to be identified because we're distinct from others. The persons with disabilities have special needs and rights. The elderly also have special rights. We need to go into the specific conditions of these groups, their set of rights, and how do we address the root causes of their discrimination, isolation, exclusion, and marginalization. If we don't get into that level of discussion, we are just scratching the surface of the pledge of leaving no one behind. Third point, sorry, I think is strengthening integration between global, regional, and thematic processes. Again, the issue of silos, right? There are so many things happening, regionals, thematic meetings. You have discussions on financing for development. You have discussions on food security. We have the recommendations from the human rights systems on the obligation of states to their human rights obligations. This is not being integrated in the whole discussion of sustainable development, where they play a key, they are critical elements. So we need to integrate all these aspects or all these processes and have at least the key findings and recommendations also be part of the discussion in the HLPF to make it more integrated. And finally, sorry, I'm taking the, is to have an action-oriented outcome. What we are having is a ministerial declaration that is pre-negotiated before the HLPF. I mean, and we call that, so in other words, we need political leadership that will actually provide the policy pathways on how we address the barriers, the challenges to advance the implementation of the SDGs. And in that, so we need the ministerial declaration not as a pre-negotiated, but should reflect the true discussions, the discussions of the HLPF in relation to substantive issues, in relation to integrating results and findings from other processes, and putting forward action points to move us forward, and that we measure how we are advancing with those recommendations. So unless we make those kinds of action, then the HLPF will end up more as a what? Talk shop. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. So we will open the floor once again, and I know that there are many who will like to speak, but I know I won't be able to get to all of you. Please try to focus on the themes of this session, which is on institutional arrangements, and please try to keep your comments short. I'm actually going to turn first to a couple of people who represent various stakeholder groups that haven't had a chance to speak yet, who have asked for the floor. So we have from the Persons with Disabilities, Mohammed, please, followed by Lorelei. If you could tell me where you are, Lorelei.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the panelists for their wonderful interventions. You said everything. You haven't left anything for me to say, but I would like to emphasize a few points as sort of recommendations that the stakeholder group of persons with disabilities would like to emphasize. Number one, we would like to recommend that the review process of HLPF must emphasize the political role of this global framework to enhance the action-oriented follow-up steps and recommendations and outcomes on after the review process, in order to make sure that governments are efficiently committed to solving global issues through mechanisms of multilateralism and partnership. Secondly, we notice that the review or process of the SDGs take place through a system of or a manner of silos. We would like to emphasize the interlinkaged manner of this review process. While we appreciate to sit here, exchange, and learn about individual experiences of implementation by member states, we would like to see more focus through the dialogues on global issues like women, children and youth, persons with disabilities, indigenous people, aging, and so on and so forth. Number three, while we really enjoy the dialogues that take place through the VNR process, but we want to see rather a meaningful and effective dialogue taking place between governments and stakeholder groups, with definitely ensuring safe space, especially for safe stakeholder groups, given the different experiences we've heard recently. And last but not least, I would like to emphasize the inclusivity of the process of HLPF and the VNR and the implementation of the SDGs, especially for persons with disabilities, with mainly ensuring appropriate allocation of resources through inclusive budgeting and funding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Lorelei, please.
Yes. Good evening. I'm Lorelei Covero from Ibon International, and I'm speaking in behalf of APRSEM. And I would just with what Joan Carling have stated so far regarding recommendations to the HLPF. And just one thing to add regarding CSO engagement during HLPF. We think that it should be not just, token. It should be real involvement of CSOs at the HLPF, especially for the inputs from civil societies. It is not clear how inputs from civil societies are worked in or are reflected into the outcome document of the 2030 agenda during the HLPF, especially as Joan has said that the ministerial declaration is pre-negotiated prior to the HLPF. So that's a problem. And so we recommend that the civil society inputs feed into the outcome documents of Agenda 2030 or HLPF. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you would like to speak, please raise your hand. And now everybody, please look around. So I have an unenviable position. No matter how high your hand goes, I'm still going to upset people. So what I'm going to do is try to take a few from each section. And then I know some people have 2 hands raised. I'll try to take a few from each section. And then we'll see where we get. I will start with this gentleman here, and then to that woman up there on the right, and then I'm going to go to this side.
Thank you. I represent the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, a group that belongs to the major group of scientific and technological communities. We have been listening the members of the different panels, and we would like now to put an input from science and technology. Ideas, this was asked by you, ideas to be put into practice to make implementation of SDGs. And I will talk about 2 areas of SDGs, for example, in which we consider ideas that will help in furthering the scope of these 2 areas: energy supply and climate change. As you know, pursuant to policies based on implementing the SDGs, the installation of fossil fuel plants as well as hydropower plants with large reservoirs will be discontinued or largely reduced. Primary energy supply will drastically diminish combustion as the most used process to generate energy. Fossil fuels will be replaced by clean energy sources such as renewables, and even if I mention here something that will upset many of you, and nuclear. Due to the growth of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, electric power will be used in very large scale. And this will bring more transmission lines that will crisscross our countries. The stability of transmission lines to keep the electric frequency constant is a necessary condition for their operation. That is guaranteed by the existence of baseload power that will keep the frequency constant. If frequency falls due to excess of demand without compensation by supply, we will end up with very frequent blackouts. And to conclude, it will be necessary to ensure a generation of baseload power that accompanies generation by intermittent energy sources as renewables, and to provide clean baseload power in sufficient scale near the consumption centers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please. Not quite yet. Just give it a second. Yes. Oh, when it turns red, that's when you're ready. Please push the button. Wait until...
Hello?
There you go.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Bunthon Chantalaungvis. I'm representing for Alliance for Democracy in Laos. You speak about national and international work together, but Laos is dependent from Vietnam. Vietnam controls Laos everywhere, political, military, economy, culture. And we have now influence from China too, from economy. The Lao people don't have right to assembly, to media. The Lao government work together with Vietnam. They control the people in social media and on so on. How can we have SDG in the future in Laos? The international aid is not to the people, but only to the Lao government. The corruption, official corruption, every level in administration. My question for you, how we can work for a Lao nation to independent from Vietnam and from China? How can we help for the people, for the human right to speak, to media, to assembly, and so on? We need SDG for Lao in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will take 2 more from each section if you are short. If you are not short, then I won't be able to do it. So it's going to be 1 woman and 1 man from each of the 3 sections here. I'm sorry, Micah. You get to close. How about that? You're right. Yes. My apologies. If there are others in the room, raise your hands. Sorry, I sometimes fall into the same old habits. My apologies. We'll have this female, that male. That section is done. From here, yes, please. Okay, please. And over here, Zakir and the woman in the back. That's the 6. So please, we'll begin over here and move this way.
Hello. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Zhang. I'm here with Nova Academy, which is an international education organization, and I am 18 years old. Someone earlier raised that he might be the only person under 20 who is here. I might be the only other person under 20 who is here. So I think that when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, there is a sense that people don't quite understand how intersectional it is, and by people I mean particularly governments. I think that there's a lot of lack of budgetary allocation for the climate crisis because governments are not conceptualizing it as a security threat. We will improve our international security by addressing the climate crisis. We will reduce income inequality by helping women and reforming education to become more accessible. We'll fight the climate crisis by empowering small farmers en masse and doing things across the Sustainable Development Goals that are indeed intersectional. I think another thing, too, that we have to realize is we cannot fight marginalization by only trying to reach people through established institutions, especially if they're private institutions. Why is there so much more focus on business tax incentives than on microfinancing or other kinds of financing that are outsourced to the individual level? And I think the logic behind this is that everyone is the expert of their own situation. Everyone is the expert of what their individual needs are. And on that front, young people are experts of what we need. We need to listen to people and to hear the solutions that they propose for themselves. And this especially applies to young people because we will be living with the consequences of the policies and the initiatives that come out of spaces like this one. So please let us in. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to do hands from here on out so as to not applaud, and 1 minute each. Please, red hat. It's red. I've already called the 6 people.
Thank you very much. First, I want to thank the organizers of this event. It's a very important event because CSO are actually the conscience of the world. Attending an event like this sometimes can be very frustrating. I would suggest that subsequently we will be having this CSO forum before the beginning of UNGA, so that we can have our resolutions that we can give to them rather than afterwards. That's a suggestion. Then secondly, sir, how best can we ensure the sustainable development goal? I want to differ a little bit with the first speaker. We need an intergenerational collaboration. The wisdom of the ages are equally as important as the young people. We must start to tell ourselves that we'll have to put human face to what is going on. The idea of having the CSO organization is for us to act differently from government, differently from business. We should actually be the bridge or the conscience of this world. So this is the beginning of a family that is big. And I agree with her that we have to use young people. Young people are already being pushed too far. We do not need to wait until they start to act irrationally. It is time that people wake up and start to put human face. And I believe that CSO, this family, this body, can change the world and make it great again. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. So I'll be quick, and I'd like to talk about my name is Ava Gabrielle Wise, and I'm with USSDC, an NGO. I'm a member of Major Group, tied in. I'd like to talk about rethinking institutional arrangements in the way of the disproportionate representation of vulnerable populations, both within civil society and within civil society within the United Nations, the construct of the United Nations. And so I too represent an indigenous and African population within a developed nation that is not well represented within the institutions within the United Nations, the constructs within the United Nations, and look for familiar faces and representative voices within my community often and don't find them, and then therefore don't find them within the voices that are represented in the position statements. So I was happy, don't know how quite it happened, but I was happy to be welcomed to lead the draft team for the SDG 8 portion of the position paper this year, but also somewhat disheartened to find that some of those things were not well translated into the larger statements that came out of the outputs. And so my concern is that those conversations didn't, as hard as we worked within the internal processes, that they somehow did not make it into the larger voices that were translated to the member states. And so what can we do going forward to magnify our voices and increase the representation of the unheard people?
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you very much. I am Alessandra Nilo from Gestos, Brazil, and apologize for my president this morning, Bolsonaro. Sorry for that. So I think that we start the conversation today talking about contradictions, right? And I think that for us, one important reflection could be the contradictions among us, also civil society. I think we need to do this kind of homework and to think more about inequalities among ourselves. We heard a lot of people talking, how can we work together? How can we find common messages? And I think that the beauty of the SDGs is exactly this invitation for us to work together. But at the same time, it's super challenging because we ask governments to do something that we don't do ourselves. And this is something for us that needs to be fixed in order we can really push our government forward. Also, I think it's important for us to diminish this distance between international and local level. Otherwise, you'll never implement the SDGs. So I also support the idea of having the CSO forum before, so we can move forward, but also inviting again all of you tomorrow to be at the action in the plaza tomorrow. I think it's the same number of people here are there, 2 o'clock, 2 p.m. It will be very good message to our government. Thank you.
Zakir, please, very quickly.
Yes. I was looking for the person who is switching on the microphone from behind the scene, but I couldn't find it. But he is a very important person, or she is a very important person. And it is true for the decision making that who the group are, they are taking the decision from behind the scene for HLPF implementation. So we will have to find them out and send our review guiding suggestions to them. My tiny farming community still is patient enough to keep some of their food budget for my trip to different forum. And I am going forward with their bullet points. Local people are being considered as beneficiaries only for implementing any projects at the local level. But this is the time that local people have the capacity to have the partnership ability. So they have to be considered as a partner. CSOs are being discriminated in this UN forum. And we have been provided the slot when everybody is gone and we don't have access to say something to them. So this is the time that CSOs must be a party for HLPF negotiation, not only the observer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, 1 minute, please.
My name is Cecilia Navas. I'm president of the Youth for Democracy in the Americas, a student nonprofit organization. I want to let the international community know that it's time to protect the people of Venezuela who are suffering the worst humanitarian crisis ever. Please, I urge everyone here to stand with Venezuela, to pressure the Maduro regime and ensure interim President Guaido can provide the deliveries and rights needed to unlock peace, democracy, and progress in my country. It's just that I need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, I once again apologize to the colleagues on the panel. I think we've tried to prioritize voices from civil society over hearing ourselves. I say as I speak more, apologies. So thank you so much to all of you who contributed. It was very, very fruitful. And I'll turn over the floor to Antonia.
Thank you so much. So we've had a super rich conversation, and we've heard that we're about to embark upon a decade of, what was it, action and delivery, or was it delivery and action? Action and delivery. We've also heard that we're in a hangover phase after the happy adoption. We've heard that we don't live single-issue lives, that if all the people discriminated on the basis of work and descent came together, you would make up the 7th biggest nation in the world. We've heard that privatization comes at a cost, that it drives inequality. We've heard that we're in the midst of an existential crisis, that the climate crisis is an intergenerational injustice. We've heard a lot about shrinking space. And we've heard calls for a systems approach, more attention to systemic issues, calls for new ways to measure progress, fight silos, calls for addressing the money more explicitly, for progressive taxation, for meaningful and constructive dialogue, for accountability. And unfortunately, the representatives of the UN that we had invited to join us at the closing cannot be with us. We invited the presidents of ECOSOC and the General Assembly. We invited the Secretary General himself. They cannot be here with us. We do know that there is somebody from the office of the President of the General Assembly, and we're very happy to have you here. I've also been pleased to see you take notes, so thank you for that. So what we've decided to do is do a closing of our own and invite some of our fellow activists, some of the voices that we think need to be at the heart of this conversation, to share just a few reflections on what we've heard here today. And I'd like to start by inviting Micah from the LGBTI stakeholder group.
Thanks, Antonia, and thanks, Dan, the troublemaker. You know, in one way, it's an impossible task to summarize and have a reflection right away to what we heard, because I think there was so much input and so much richness because of who we are in this room. And, you know, one of the things that I picked up, and I always pick up because of who I am and what I work with, and the agenda, you know, when we adopted it, it was such a promise of leaving no one behind. And I think we all got excited about it. But then the more I listen to it, the less I hear what it actually means. So who are we talking about? What challenges are we talking about? Today in the opening of the summit, I think I heard it so many times that I lost count. The problem is that I didn't hear any actions following it. There is no content in it. And I think it's not only on the government, on the decision makers, but also our own homework to think, who are we talking about? Do we know each other or the person sitting next to you? And what the challenges they face. And, you know, many times, and you also mentioned that we're so stuck in silos. And I think one of the reasons why we are so is because of structures that we are navigating. It's the laws, it's our lives, how it is constructed. So, you know, I was joking about the binary of what you said, but this is the language that we operate within. This is what we need to neatly fit in, or not we are, you know, punished by. So, and some of you that know me know that I'm not a big fan of binaries or norms, so that's why I'm here to disrupt the system, and I think we all do it in you know, our own ways. So I would encourage to, you know, keep breaking those and remember that we are not one thing. So just when you go back home today, just lay down in bed and think how many things you are at the same time and how we can connect to each other based on that. And I guess I will just leave it to my other colleagues that we need to both transform how we work and reinvent how we work. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Micah. And we'll move to Jose from the Persons with Disabilities stakeholder group.
All right, so thank you, Dan, and thank you, Antonia, for your great facilitation. Thanks for the great presentations made by the different speakers, and even more important, for the contributions from the floor. Allow me to be frank and direct as we are closing this session. When I was listening to some of the presentations, my first reaction was, well, we are again listening to the same things that we have been saying to each other for a long time. But then I realized that if that is what was happening, it's because it's part of the diagnosis. It's because it's part of our reality. And it's fine. We don't need to be concerned, but rather try to think what we are going to do from tomorrow on. Another conclusion is that many of the presentations and statements were trying to request more action for governments and UN officials. But the problem is that we didn't have a lot of government representatives and UN officials here. So we really need to think of how we are going to start doing something differently if we really want to reach out to more governments and UN agencies. And again, if we didn't succeed, or if we were not successful in getting those governments in this room, it's maybe because there are some structural issues that we really need to face and try to solve. But on the other hand, and I have been in quite a good number of HLPF and similar forums, I think today we have started a very good exercise, and that is starting to questioning ourselves, what we want to do, and what we are willing to do, and what is the commitments we are about to take when we leave this room. So when the youth questioned how many young activists were part of our own constituencies, or when Antonia asked the business and industry representative to participate and answer one of the questions from the floor, that is exactly the right direction the civil society representatives must take if we want to succeed in this 2030 agenda. So there is a lot to do, but it's also true that we have been doing a lot of good things, and we should also be proud of that, and of course, keep doing what we are doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose. And then we'll move on to Francis from the Stakeholder Group on Aging.
Thank you, Antonia. Thank you, Danielle. And thank you, everybody, for the wonderful session we've had. My name is Francis Zainuddin, representing the Stakeholder Group on Aging. I want all of us to give ourselves a pat on the back for all that we do. Please remember that NGOs have had a long history of reaching out to those left behind. When governments have failed, NGOs have been there. When there is famine, NGOs have been there. When there is a health crisis, NGOs have been there. When there is conflict, NGOs have been there. When human rights have been violated, NGOs have been there. Sadly, some human rights defenders have been persecuted and some have died for defending the rights of others. We are there. NGOs know a thing or two about leaving no one behind. Let us be proud and not be depressed about what we do and what we have accomplished. So to governments, I say, we are not only watchdogs, we are also implementers, and we can also be partners. When I was young, at 18, I thought I could change the world. As a very much older person now, at 78, I still believe I can change the world. Even though I may not even be around in 2030. One thing I have learned is that we must be forever vigilant, and we must all exercise the power of the vote to ensure that all people of all ages everywhere can lead long lives with prosperity and dignity. Let us all work together to achieve the SDGs, and let us all be very proud of what we are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. And with that, we have come to the end. I would, however, like to thank our colleagues from the Office of Intergovernmental Support and Coordination for Sustainable Development, because without you, where's Jordan and Gwilym and everyone? Without you, it wouldn't have been possible. So really, I'd also like to thank the person with the power to switch on the microphones. We think he sits there. And Dan and I would like to thank all of you in advance for the work that you're going to do over this decade of action and delivery, for your work continuing to disrupt things, continuing to be troublemakers, and continuing to challenge others and ourselves. Thank you so much for being with us today.